All right. Bismillah. In the name of God, I'm here once again with our good friend Matt Douglas. We're going to talk a little bit about theory today. And the angle of theory that we're going to basically touch on the bare bones basics, is the question of Karl Marx's eco-socialism, or ecology and environmentalism. Now, usually when people think of Marxism, ecology and environmentalism has been usually assumed to be out of the configuration of Marxist productivism. Now, as it appears, and as a lot of research, especially in the last 30 years, has shown, that is actually not the case at all. In fact, there are a series of notebooks of Karl Marx that have appeared that is the subject of a very, very important book that I recommend people go and buy and read cover to cover, published in 2017. Author is Kohei Saito, and it is entitled Karl Marx's Eco-Socialism: Capital, Nature, and Unfinished Critique of Political Economy, published by New York University Press and published, like I said, in 2017. I read this book about 3 months ago, and it basically picks up on where Paul Burkett and John Bellamy had left at the discussion. These two had published books, each of them respectively in the 1980s and 1990s. Paul Burkett published a book called Marx and Nature, and John Bellamy Foster published a book called Marx's Ecology. They basically did an analysis of the entire corpus and oeuvre of Karl Marx to try to gauge where Marx was coming from on the question of environmentalism and ecology. And they actually, both of them, reached very positive conclusions. And contrary to Marxist-Leninists and many Marxists of the previous generation, whose approach to environmentalism and ecology has been extremely problematic, and some have even labeled as being Promethean, correctly in my opinion. With Marx himself, the question whether we are just analyzing the published text, or now with the notebooks that Cato is looking at, the question of ecology was actually foremost on Karl Marx's mind. And in fact, dialectical materialism, the methodology that is introduced, especially after the 1847, 1848 Communist Manifesto, and particularly in the volumes of Das Kapital, Karl Marx also assumed metabolism, ecological metabolism. Now, Marxists of subsequent generations didn't take this on board, to the detriment. And we saw where this all led, for example, in the Soviet experiment, or the Chinese experiment, and some of the other experiments, socialist experiments that were done in the global South. But since these notebooks have come out, and especially now that they're being translated and very piecemeal being published, we're beginning to see that Karl Marx really understood the question, and he understood the crisis of capitalism, not just in terms of the issue of class and class struggle, but also first and foremost over the question of limited resources, and how the interactions between all of these elements establishes a metabolism, either a metabolism of equilibrium or a metabolism of disequilibrium, which capitalism represents. Now, I find this extremely interesting. And if had the Marxists, for example, of the last generation, of the early 20th century, understood this angle of classical Marxism, for example, had Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, Lenin, been attuned to this argument, or Trotsky, I think that much of the excesses that we witnessed during the 20th century by those experiments in Russia and elsewhere would not have been, would have not transpired. For example, the manner in which the USSR dispossessed an entire traditional class of peasants, the kulaks, in the late 1920s, and how that class was completely decimated to lead the way for mass industrialization in the Soviet Union that led to massive degradation of the environment, and eventually, with the accidents that we saw in the 1980s with Chernobyl, etc. And more ecologically and environmentally attuned Marxism would have not committed those mistakes. But what's very interesting now is that most environmentalists and ecologists up till now have dismissed Marxism, and have dismissed Marxism because of the productivist bias that was always attached to it. And now, as we're beginning to find out that this was not the case at all, and that Karl Marx, to his credit, was very well aware of some of the problems that are being grappled with at the moment. Matt,
Okay, well,
Matt,
what
go
I'm
ahead.
immediately thinking when you start saying that is, now to some extent, this reality that you talk about of places like the Soviet Union just not going along with that may very well have been due to, Marx's work not being translated or being censored by other powers that be, etc. But there's also just, I think we have to take into account maturity. Because in a sense, okay, this absolute lack of respect for the environment is adolescent.
Mm.
When you're a kid, you kind of just do your chores, whatever mommy and daddy say. Okay, when you become an adolescent, start coming into your own power, you want to do whatever you want and just throw any responsibility out the window. Not realizing that there is responsibility that comes with privilege. When you grow into an adult.
When you say that, it's very interesting that you say that, because when you say that, when we unpack that argument and place it in a theoretical abstract context, this is essentially what Marx is talking about when he speaks about metabolism. Yeah. The metabolism of or the dynamic metabolism of things. Because a proper ecological metabolism of a well-functioning, healthy socialist society takes precisely that dynamic and that reality into consideration, and doesn't do the kind of things that we're witnessing at the moment, for example.
Yeah. So part of it's just, on one part of me, as much as I agree with it, it's very likely a lot of Marx was censored. There's also a part of me that's saying, well, were some of these mistakes bound to happen along the way?
I don't think there were censored. There's no evidence that there were censored. Marx's ongoing critique of political economy, which was, the first volume of which came out while he was still alive, which is Das Kapital, or Capital. The thing is that the subsequent volumes of that opus on political economy were actually assembled by Friedrich Engels, and very hastily, and even he admitted to this himself. Certain, for example, in the very final volume, or the fourth volume of Das Kapital, it's very obvious that a lot of these arguments that are being written are being hastily cobbled together, and that they're unfinished arguments. A lot of that is because Marx didn't get to finish it.
Right.
And Engels had to go on, notebooks that were, available to him. And, as several scholars are now arguing, they're saying that Engels didn't even assemble these correctly in the right order. So if you sit down and read all four volumes of Das Kapital, other than the first volume, that is, in my opinion, a coherent work in and of itself, the other three volumes, one can pretty much, at the moment, given what we know now, about the state of these writings, pretty much shelf altogether, right? The first volume is exceedingly important for a very basic reason, is because this is where Karl Marx deals with the labor theory of value, how value is created in a bourgeois capitalist society. Why do commodities, gain value, and what is then the relationship and the interrelationship between value, commodity, and then exchange, and all of these various things. These are extremely complex, but also very important, both historical, analytical, and theoretical arguments that people need to take on board. As I've said in the past, obviously, given where we're at 140 plus years after these books were first published, the state of capitalism has evolved beyond a lot of these arguments. But nevertheless, in order to understand the very basics of what Marx was talking about, we need to take a lot of these arguments on board. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah. But yeah, I'm kind of coming from like the psychological angle on it, so because that's my expertise. But yeah, it is. As I was saying, there's a certain maturity we need to grow into that is painfully lacking. And it seems to me like, you get different groups and they have parts of it. But, and it's where theory comes in, and where it kind of is the linchpin of the other factors, because it is kind of what brings them all together. Like, for example, I'll say a little bit about where I am right now in Thailand. People listening, there's a lot of protests going on, and that's true. And yes, they are against a government that is military and that did take power about 5 years ago. What you don't hear in the Western press is that the people they threw out were billionaires and Western sellouts. And that these protests are U.S. funded. U.S. or I should say corporatocracy funded, which is mainly U.S., but Britain, France, Western Europe, and the Five Eyes in general are going to have some stakes in all of it. Part of it's just that Thailand's near China and there's a big power contest, and the West is doing what it's always done, of trying to get somebody else to fight its battles forward, or just create a little chaos, among its rivals, neighbors, that sort of thing. But what you have a total lack of theory here. Now, interestingly enough, you do, like I said, although like in the Western press, they'll call the government that took power conservative, and just looking in terms of liberal conservative, the way it is done in the West just doesn't fit. But they are, and I won't say they're even anti-capitalist, because they're really not, but they are to some extent at least anti-imperialist, just by standing up to this. And it's interesting that you have what you really don't have in the West at all is enough people to have, or at least people willing to use force. Now, granted, the coup they did was bloodless. If they wanted to arrest or kill the prime minister who they ousted, they could have, and didn't. They basically gave her time to run. And you also have, so it's and you even though there are protests going on right now, but they are the cops are sending some resistance to, they're going to great lengths to not to hurt anybody, even if the Western press will try and slant that any way they could to make them look bad. For example, they were using water cannons just to spray people with dye, but you could tell that they were spraying it overhead, not directly, and just the protesters all use umbrellas as shields. And frankly, if you're aiming a water cannon at someone directly, that umbrella is going to collapse real quick. And they didn't do that. But you do see a willingness to use force. Whereas in the West, you have pretty much no one willing to do that. Partially, though, that's rational due to a lack of numbers. But people stay sitting with theory, and nothing but theory. And theory's good, but without the action, it's lacking. So it's kind of interesting, the contrast. Whereas one place you get some force, other place you get some theory, but no place really has both. And there's really one of the big failings of the current government in Thailand is not that they're not on the right side so much as they take a very paternalistic approach and don't educate the people. So when, Western proxies come in, it's very easy for them to sucker, because they'll just throw around terms like democracy and human rights, which are every bit as hollow here as they are in the West. Not that I don't agree with the general ideas, but we all know how much of a joke they are when they're said in a lot of modern politics. So people just take right to it, because there hasn't been a real big discussion among theory.
Well, I don't think this is a problem just in Thailand. I think this is a problem everywhere. To its credit, at least the people, the participants at Zuccotti Park in Occupy Wall Street itself, were attempting to have the sort of teach-ins that we saw in the 1960s during the moratorium movement, protesting the Vietnam War. So you had people, teaching the text of Fanon, like The Wretched of the Earth, or Paulo Freire's, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, etc. So there was an attempt, and this was as recent as only 9 years ago that this was being attempted. But you're right. I mean, there is a complete lack of being clued in to theory and just a real well-developed political consciousness in the current generation of political activists, globally, is lacking. And this is why these sorts of movements always end up being subverted, even, with Occupy Wall Street itself, but especially with, movements like the Arab Spring. The people that went into that went in very half-cocked, and ended up having their movement hijacked from right at the get-go. Even though I agree, the people that marched in Tahrir Square, the students and the middle class that went there and protested, those people initially that showed up to that thing had the best intentions in mind. But the Egyptian deep state, which is a valid category, and it's not what these conspiracy theorists in the West have tried to make of it, moved in. The Egyptian military moved in. They themselves got rid of Mubarak, and then hijacked the whole thing. Initially installed the Muslim Brotherhood. Then a year later, had a coup against the Muslim Brotherhood and installed Sisi as the president of Egypt, and on it goes. This is a problem, but this is an issue. This is a problem that has been socially engineered since the 1960s. The global oligarchy as a whole, not just the American one, but they got so spooked by what they beheld in the late 1960s, whether in the United States or in Europe, that they swore that they would never allow something like this to happen again. And this is where someone like Giodi Preparata, in that very important book of his, The Ideology of Tyranny, is correct in saying that, the entry and the popularity of this deconstruction and postmodernist rubbish that came via, actors such as Michel Foucault and then Jacques Derrida, etc., was precisely an attempt to compartmentalize and segmentize so many different elements of the left that it would not be able to rise as a force in the same manner that it rose in the late 1960s, whether in the United States or Europe. I mean, because let's not kid ourselves. Whether on one side of the Atlantic or the other, that student movement of the late 1960s, from 67 to 69, and I would say all the way to about 1971, 72, until probably Wounded Knee, that movement came extremely close to dislodging this establishment on both sides of the Atlantic. And had they succeeded, obviously we would be living in a much different world. However, had they succeeded, the question then arises, what would have a bloc like the Eastern Bloc, like the Soviet bloc, try to do with that situation? Would they have tried to take advantage of it? Would they try to have accommodated? Would they have tried to take it over? How would they have dealt with it? So these are all valid questions. But nevertheless, the activists of that generation of the 1960s, especially from the actual student movements, were far more adept, were far more educated, were far more attuned to the issues that they were dealing with on hand than the current generation that we have witnessed. Whether this be the generation that went to Zuccotti Park with completely valid concerns and valid issues that they were protesting, or the people that went into Tahrir Square, or whatever. But the issue comes down to this. The American empire has so perfected the art of the regime change. They have so, of the color revolution, etc. They have so perfected that art that, any attempt at a counter narrative to this Gene Sharp incorporated color revolutions that they have fostered in the world will be vigorously resisted. However, there's a silver lining. And we're beginning to see this silver lining now on the waning of the power of Donald Trump. And that is, as the United States, as this American oligarchy, together with the global oligarchy, are preoccupied with what the results of November 3rd is going to be, they're basically sort of standing back and letting certain things play themselves out. So now we're seeing that in Bolivia, after that coup that the American government and the CIA forced it on the people of Bolivia with the cheerleading of that demon, Elon Musk, now have, through the polls, not through the gun or the bullet, but through the ballot, have managed to win a landslide victory against that junta that the Americans imposed on the people of Bolivia. So that is now a closed and shut case. Inshallah, let's hope. Let's hope Evo Morales returns back to Bolivia soon and picks up where he left off. And if he doesn't want to continue in any kind of a leadership or presidency, that's fine. That revolution that he started in Bolivia needs to continue, and it needs to be an inspiration for the rest of the region, including Brazil, that is currently in the hands of a complete lunatic, worse than Donald Trump. Nevertheless, behind all of these equations, I think that one of the reasons why the current generation is not as adept as it used to be is that perhaps, from one angle, they were not ready for it yet. Maybe it is time that the new theories are made now. Maybe because there is just so many various opinions, and especially from contemporary scholars of Marxism, that what needs to happen now is a sort of synthesis of many ideas, a culling of things that didn't work and throwing them out, a synthesization of things that do work. So, for example, this angle about the ecological Marx is extremely important. This discussion of metabolism is extremely timely. All the rest of the stuff that doesn't work can be thrown out. A lot of the stuff that the Frankfurt School did, in my opinion, or the postmodernists, this stuff needs to be chucked out wholesale because it's proven it's metal, and its metal is not all that great.
Now people are even using the Frankfurt School as just. I heard someone the other day, and granted they were basing it off of a Heritage Foundation article I read when I did research. I'll research that. Even because the Frankfurt School, from what I have seen, wasn't really Marxist so much as they were social critics of all kinds, and they liked Marx just because he was one.
Sure,
you have
but
absolute nutballs like Adorno.
Adorno. There's some good things about Adorno. Walter Benjamin, in my opinion, is one of the better figures out of that Frankfurt School. I'm in agreement with one person who's on my Facebook poll that he was a straight shooter. But the Frankfurt School was actually an entity funded by the Central Intelligence Agency.
Yes.
For a very specific purpose. To destabilize the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union, specifically for the sole purpose, of eventually taking it down and weaponizing Marxism to that end. So this is known. This is known by many people. And some of their ideas are good, but some of their ideas are very partial. Benjamin, like I said, is one of the better characters that came out of that crowd of people. But the Frankfurt School, in my opinion, is passé. We need to Marxism, socialism. These ideas need to take
they need to grow up.
They need to grow up. For example, the question that is on the minds of a lot of people, for example, in the United States that I talk to, there's this particular gentleman, Jeffrey Ganswitz, is the question of belief and religiosity and socialism, right? Now, with the tradition of the 20th century Marxists, they were all radical atheists, right? But when you go to the text of Karl Marx himself, he's not a radical atheist. He's more of a agnostic. He doesn't really get into theological questions. He critiques the church. He critiques the power of the church, or even the behavior. For example, in the Jewish question, he a text that is actually claimed by certain people to be an anti-Semitic text by Marx. He puts comment on the social conditioning of European Jews, but by and large, Marx did not delve into theological questions. And number one, because he felt that he wasn't competent, and number two, it wasn't relevant to the project that he was pursuing. So radical atheism and Marxism are not synonymous, in the mind of Marx. And once we enter the discussion of ecology, it becomes completely irrelevant. So, perhaps it is now the time that with, a ecological, eco-socialist theory, that the question of atheism and radical atheism be completely set aside, and that we would start to talk as God-fearing Marxists, for lack of a better word, which is what the Latin American liberation theologians themselves were.
I'll go one step further too, and I would say it's just as you were talking about the Frankfurt School being, basically false Marxism set up to corrupt it, to take it down. We can almost look as making Marx's supposed atheism more radical can be looked at as a way, although yes, it might have gone against a lot of the colonial religion, like what is most Christianity today, it also went against all the indigenous traditions and their spirituality, which were much more vulnerable to take it down. And so therefore it, ended up by the radical atheism that came in to Marxism or to socialism, communism in general, actually served the powers that be by deculturally identifying all these indigenous people. It actually contributed to that.
Yeah, sure. And I think that liberation theologians and also the pedagogists in Latin and South America realized that very quickly. I mean, look, Evo Morales and his whole entire indigenous socialist movement in Bolivia, these people are not atheists. They're not radical or otherwise. They're believers, but their concept of spirit is very different to the Western one. They look at the earth as being a spiritual entity, right? The sky, the air, the elements. These are ideas that we as Bayanis, as Alibabis, completely relate to because of the ordinance in the Bayan about, the sanctity of the four elements. That's where they're coming from. So if the colonial narrative of religion, which is, basically either the Catholic or the Protestant evangelical ideologies that have been imposed by force on these First Nations people, if we put these out of the equation, there are many models of spirituality, and there are, many theologies that can then become the basis in which, to formulate a sort of socialist spirituality,
And one that is. It doesn't have to be one. It can respect each, it can be localized.
Yeah, it could be local, like the Zapatistas in Mexico have proven, that this can, because they're Mayans and they practice spirituality. And even if there are Christians amongst us, this is a great thing. I mean, the liberation theologians have proved this in their own case. And there's not a problem because, if one reads scripture, not like these evangelical, prosperity bunnies, who are, in my opinion, heretics to the message of the gospel. But if one actually
heretics is putting it lightly.
But if
blasphemers.
they're blasphemers. Absolutely, they're blasphemers. But if one reads one's scripture, Jesus Christ was very much, on that exact same wavelength that we're talking about.
Yes.
So there's no problem with that in having an eco-socialist, program with the Gospels also informing. That's actually quite welcome, as a matter of fact. But what we need to get away from is these hegemonic narratives, whether it be that of the Catholic Church in its Vatican version, or that of evangelical Protestant Christianity, and because both of these have done such immeasurable damage to Latin and South America, and both the indigenous people as well as the mestizo people of that land, that it's incalculable.
So and it doesn't say, same damage to the indigenous to North America, Africa, Australia, and they're trying to do it to Asia. So.
And then on the wings of all of that, you have cults like the Baha'is trying to fish in muddy waters. Anyway, we don't want to talk about them in this podcast. Just throwing that out there, But go ahead, Ben.
No, and again, this is not to say that that people can't also additionally be an atheist in the movement. Okay, that's your thing, okay, because there's so many things to focus on, these people can focus on, on the material. We need people to do that. But there's no reason why they can't work with someone who is, for lack of a better term, spiritual, which I think is the word we'd use, even if that term has been just so warped, but spiritual, religious, whatever, that there is, it's both can be used in service to the people.
Absolutely.
And
one thing I think that people need to disabuse themselves of in light of what we're beginning to learn about Karl Marx's, ecological environmental ideas, is that actually Karl Marx was not a Promethean at all.
Define what you mean by a Promethean, because I know the myth very well, but how do you put it?
Well, Promethean in the sense that stealing knowledge from the gods and giving it to an unworthy humanity. That's okay. not Marx very much understood the balances of things, and he didn't wish to delve into theological issues because that was not his domain. But nevertheless, someone who comprehends an issue such as metabolism in light of a dialectical framework of the universe, by definition, cannot be a Promethean.
Yeah.
Because they understand that there's a bigger picture at work. And if there is a bigger picture at work, then they're no Promethean. They're actually doing the God's works.
They're not seeing God and man as contradictory.
No, they're not antagonists. Yeah.
I mean, because some people would use Promethean just to would use the term almost just to be anti-oligarchical, just because of the way the oligarchy would like to consider itself godlike and above the rules. But that's not really what we're talking about here.
No, that's not what we're talking about at all.
We're anti-oligarchical, yeah, but we're looking at it in a much different light. And I think, though, I mentioned, that there's the force part of it, there's the theory part of it, and there's the third part of it, of any fight, which is the occult, for lack of a better.
Absolutely.
And by someone being, where I do think the militant atheism can be harmful, is that it just rips this out of the fight. So if if you have an opponent who uses it, even if they don't admit to using it, you're already at a disadvantage. You don't want to believe in it, fine, okay, but don't bother the people who are fighting on that front.
Yep.
And one thing, because I think, here in Thailand, this is a nation that resisted colonialism when all their neighbors didn't. And, well, they had some good armies and they fought well. They wouldn't have lasted if the various empires, who had conquered territories they could steal conscripts from, and lots of them, they would eventually whittle them down. So I think there probably had to be some occult in it. It's probably some state secret and all, but, just how they did it. But there's, it's reasonable to think that there was probably an element. But what I'm seeing that is a little worrisome is that I have seen one occult element among these protesters, and I don't see a counter to it. And that is simply that they've ripped off, as like their signal to each other. They've adapted the signal that was used in Hunger Games, the three fingers like this. And there's no counter, which to me, that in and of itself, that's just another piece of evidence that this is Western backed. Now, granted, I can find much more direct stuff that it's Western backed, and even go online and show you where you got people like Soros funding this shit. Which I think is much more direct. But that is something from a Hollywood movie with a predominantly white cast. If they were really trying to join with the oppressed peoples in the world, they'd be raising their fist in the air. Or at least maybe have some gesture that's more Thai. Certainly not a Western one. Okay, so on that level, at the very least, if, you want to counter this Western color revolution, I would think, have the forces that want to do that come up with, their own gesture. Especially, if they don't want to take anybody else's historically, take something from their own culture that, that will be inspiring. So, because half the occult is, what I call spell work, directing of energy. The other of which is, is psychology, is mind, is working with the mind and the emotions and things like that, and how things like symbols play off there. So I think and if you ignore that aspect, you ignore it at your own peril.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, the election of Donald Trump in 2016 proved that, because with the 4chans and 3chans and, this alt-right that was working all of these, little interstices of the internet, it was through the image of Kek, this frog.
Yeah.
That, basically on the level of the mimicry, Donald Trump's candidacy on that occult level was swept into victory. Now, this time around, we don't have that. And most of the figures of the alt-right, from Richard Spencer to Giorgiani et al., they've all abandoned Donald Trump, which is, one reason, in my opinion, that perhaps Donald Trump may not win a second term and won't win this election come on November 3rd. But yes, I mean, the role of the occult in politics, well, obviously has been there from the very beginning. Ideology itself is a occult gimmick. The belief or convincing the public that you are participating within these democratic pageants, that you're actually, determining, the electorate is determining, the outcome of the movement of a social contract itself is an occult ploy.
Yeah.
Whereas we know that, we're not living under a social contract anymore, that the society has become actually Hobbesian, that it's more the vision of Thomas Hobbes than Jean-Jacques Rousseau that is operating in so-called liberal democracies. So, the belief, false belief itself, and the reinforcement of false belief in the population at large itself is a form of sorcery. So the occult is everywhere. Anything that convinces, anything that produces a consensus is a form of occultism, whatever it is. So politics is the occult, is the art of the occult. We don't even have to get into the question of symbols, etc., or what some people would define as high magic, to realize that the occult is everywhere, around us all the time.
Like with anything, if you deny that it's there and don't look at it, then it comes out sideways, and it comes out in destructive forms, and the other guy who does use it wins. Because
these forces, like the existence of God, don't really care whether you believe in them or not. These things exist. Yeah. And, I think it is a disservice that human beings make to themselves when they dismiss certain ideas because they sound a certain way or have been latched on to certain people. Now, by the same token, we don't have to, that's not to say that certain forces will manipulate. For example, with conspiracy theories, we know that there are certain things as conspiracy facts, right? Yeah. But we have also realized, especially in the last 20 years since 9/11, is that establishments themselves will churn out infinite false stories and false narrative as a means to create smokescreens.
Yeah. When you say false narratives, let's clarify that we don't just mean they themselves lying about themselves, but just put out false conspiracy theory, for lack of a better term. Yeah. False stories that they don't take credit for, that they let circulate as, like you said, smokescreen or misinformation,
Yeah.
Just delusion.
Yeah. These are all forms of sorcery. That sowing of misinformation in society is itself a form of sorcery, and intelligence agencies, whether government or corporate, are adept at these skills. Yes. They know what they're doing. So, people can believe or disbelieve as much as they like about these things. It doesn't, negate the reality of it. Yeah. But, returning to the subject at hand, the subject at hand is that, the right-wing Anglo-American plutocracy over the last 70, 80, 90 years, or longer, actually, I would say from the beginning of the 20th century, or pretty much from the era of the Second Internationale to this moment, has sought by every means necessary to discredit the global labor movement, socialism itself in whatever variety, whether it be Marxist, Fabian, or otherwise. And the fact of the matter is that, like, for example, we had that fool, Dale Husband, doing that red baiting with me several months ago. The fact is that none of these people, and especially American liberals, unless they have actually engaged these arguments, read the books, been involved in the movement, have looked at the bigger picture, have analyzed the historical trajectory of things, have no idea what they're talking about when they say things, for example, that socialism has failed wherever it has gone. Well, actually, that's not true. In Cuba, it has actually worked extremely well.
Well, I'd say the big counter to that also is name one time when, and I won't just limit it to socialism, but any collective society where they, try to help each other, which would include just about every indigenous society before the European imperialists invaded.
Yeah.
Name one socialist society, ancient or modern, that has not been under constant attack.
Well, this is exactly the point.
And if some of those are going to lose, so that doesn't mean that the whole system doesn't work. We talked about Wallace.
Yeah, when we talk about Wallace, when we talk about not just Wallace, when we talk about the Zapatistas, when we talk about Cuba, when we talk about these little communes and communities in the favelas of Brazil that successfully implemented these models of pedagogies that Paulo Freire first wrote about in the 1960s. These are not failed experiments.
No.
The thing is that, these American liberals and libertarians, not to mention the right-wing cohorts in the American version of the Tories, which are the Republican Party, they want to discredit these movements, but by the same token, they never acknowledge the fact that those, for a country like the USSR to even current contemporary People's Republic of China, is that the amount of undermining by the global Western imperial powers against these societies from the moment that these societies were founded was relentless. I mean, Winston Churchill, for example, within a few weeks after the success of the October Revolution in Petrograd, in St. Petersburg, proclaimed that Bolshevism needs to be killed in its cradle, that this baby needs to be strangled in its cradle. And immediately, once these reactionary white armies began to form themselves against the nascent USSR, you had Woodrow Wilson, the man who that Europe was lauding as the Messiah at the time, because of his. He was a racist. I mean, Woodrow Wilson was one of the most bigoted U.S. presidents in all American history. He sent American troops to Vladivostok. The Japanese sent troops to Vladivostok. The Brits sent contingency forces to fight against the Bolsheviks and help the whites. So you got to look at the whole historical unfolding of all this. I'm not trying to be an apologist for either Leninism or Stalinism. I think both were so off the rails, that you cannot defend them, especially with the Stalinist experiments. But the fact of the matter, when people, ignorant, white American liberals like Dale Husband say things that, socialism is a failed model wherever it's gone, these people don't know what they're talking about, right? Socialism in, at least the democratic socialist model in Western Europe until the fall of the Berlin Wall was actually the operative system within most of Western Europe and West Germany itself, let alone the Scandinavian countries. Or France, etc. So, socialism, has in fact worked. Democratic socialism, social democracy have worked. We have historical experience. Yes, the Soviet model did not work. But the Titoist model in the former Yugoslavia before the Western imperialists tore that country apart, worked splendidly. You talk to people who lived under, the socialist system in former Yugoslavia, And that system, albeit with a few flaws here and there, and nothing to like what it was in the rest of Eastern Europe, had nothing but nostalgia for those times. And it's not a misplaced nostalgia of the kind that you find amongst certain Russians today about the former USSR. This is a genuine nostalgia, because what Tito built until his death in 1980 and until the rise of Milosevic, very dubious character, that society worked well for its people, and for all these ethnicities, the Serbs, the Croats, the Bosnian Herzegovinans, the Kosovars, etc. These people lived in peace amongst each other. There was a lot of intermarriage. That was a true multicultural, multi-ethnic society right in the heart of the Adriatic, and it was destroyed deliberately. The USSR got top-heavy. The way that they were managing their society was, things were falling apart. Now, not to cut any slack to Mikhail Gorbachev, because in my book, this guy was either a completely stupid man, or someone who was just like a sellout. He gave up the fight too easily, and he unleashed forces and let a genie out of the bottle that then consumed that country. And everything that we are witnessing today in this demonic kind of reaction from the Russian Federation and this bizarre leadership of Vladimir Putin, who's trying to destabilize the West, is as a consequence of what the Americans and the Western Europeans did by taking advantage of that situation with Mikhail Gorbachev and taking that entire system down.
Yeah. A
system that had, for all of its flaws and all of its brutality, at least during the Brezhnev years, did seem to work for the majority of its Soviet citizens. And there was no plan, even by the West, itself, that wanted the USSR to fall, or what they were going to do in the eventuality that system did crumble, right? And now they're sitting and wondering why, these Russians are so pissed off at them, and they want to, they're out for blood. Why, for example, the revenge of the Russian people came in the form of Donald Trump. Well, if I am in the Kremlin, if I'm a former KGB man, head of the Russian Federation, and I'm thinking in the long term about America's and the West's comeuppance, Donald Trump would be exactly what the doctor ordered. Now, I don't believe, at least for my self-interest, for my political self-interest and that of my comrades, that these Trump years have been good. They have been very bad, and I stood against all of that during 2016, just like you did. But one also has to begin to understand where certain parties, such as the Russians, have been coming from. If they hack the American elections to destabilize it and put Donald Trump into power, what does that tell you about the state of the United States? Yeah. What does it tell you about the state of the corruption of the actors within the American polity, particularly among the Republican Party, where such a thing apparently amidst the greatest, most so-called democratic country on earth, where it is possible to infiltrate a complete clown and a wrecking ball like Donald Trump and put him into the White House. What does that tell you?
Populists just went along with it.
And that the populists went along with it.
Yeah. And also going on the success or lack thereof of socialism, even things that we look at as unsuccessful, when you consider the odds they're under, sometimes it can be almost miraculous. Like, nobody has to be a fan of, say, North Korea, but the fact that they've survived after the U.S. killed so many people that we actually took away like 1/4, 1/5. The fact that they're even a country.
There was a gentleman. This was a Belarusian gentleman in Berlin, and he was an older guy, and he had lived in the GDR before it fell. And he said to Roya and I, one time we went to dinner at his house, that what the Americans and the Western Europeans did in breaking apart the Eastern Bloc and the USSR was like Operation Barbarossa by Hitler, but on steroids, but a lot slower.
Yeah,
I kind of I come to this conclusion because what you saw, the social devastation, economic and political devastation that wreaked on that nation was of such magnitude. For example, one example of it, you had all these extremely educated, professionals in that old system. Men and women, people with multiple PhDs, these doctors, physician, professionals, scientists, etc., women especially. All of a sudden, they find themselves without work. Their institutions no longer exist. So all these very professional, highly respected intellectuals and professionals of the USSR, of the Soviet era, all of a sudden are forced by the circumstances that the West had created for these people to become prostitutes, selling their backside. Whether we're talking about Russia itself or the republics, or countries like Czechoslovakia or Hungary, etc. The injustice that was perpetrated on these people of the former Eastern Bloc is something that is only now beginning to become appreciated. So on one hand, one has to have empathy for the Vladimir Putins for what they did. I don't like Vladimir Putin. He is a thug. And I've been very unequivocal about not cutting any slack for this guy. Nevertheless, one has to also look at the problem from his perspective. So if the Russian Federation government is destabilizing the West, right, the reasons have to be asked. And the reasons are obvious, is because the Anglo-Americans and the Western Europeans have been doing this stuff to these people since the 1990s and before.
Yeah. Well, and they've actually got, and the biggest sorcery they've used on the American people itself is, these people hate our, nice, kind, peaceful way of life. It's like, well, no, it's not kind and peaceful to them. You have to ask the question, why do they hate us? And there's reasons, because that lifestyle fucks them over.
But it's been done deliberately. Look, Ronald Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush made a series of agreements with Mikhail Gorbachev on these missile systems, right?
Yeah.
And they promised Gorbachev in writing, especially in that last Helsinki Accord that they had, that the Americans, once, this Iron Curtain and Germany unified, that Americans would move all of this stuff out of Middle Europe, right? Once Bill Clinton became president of the United States, not only did he renege on that deal, but the American military and the American intelligence establishment basically went all the way to the borders of Russia itself. They went into Romania, they went into Hungary, they went into Poland, they went into both the Czech and Slovak republics, etc., with complete disregard. Now, Boris Yeltsin at the time was too incompetent and too drunk to deal with that problem, right? And he was dealing with the mess left after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But once Vladimir Putin came up, he was out for blood. And so the manner in which Putin has now reconstituted the power, the Russian power, is quite an impressive thing that he has done. So you have to give the man his credit. Like I said, I am no Russian apologist. I can't stand these people. But nevertheless, you have to give credit where credit is due.
Yeah.
And what they have managed to do in kind of resetting a balance, and even in that process with the ability to destabilize their nemesis in the manner in which they have, you have to be impressed by this. Now, whether this is the strategies of Alexander Dugin, another character that I don't particularly like very much, or otherwise, even in my opinion, people like Charles Upton who are writing against Alexander Dugin, or these people who are writing against Alexander Dugin, and even though I completely recognize the fact that Alexander Dugin is a Satanist, right? The fact is that without what the Anglo-Americans did, without what the Europeans did, there would be no Alexander Dugin. There would not be this sort of state-sponsored kind of stuff that has been unfolding against these people since the 1990s, right? So here we are. The question now is for people on both sides, in the West, on the Atlantic side, and on the Eurasianist side, right? These models are not going to take us anywhere. Eurasianism is a form of fascism, period. The Atlantean vision is one that is crumbling, and it's about time that it did so. We need to rebuild this planet. If we don't, we will die. It is as simple as that. Yeah. Now, Marx wed to environmentalism, wed to radical environmentalism, and to deep esoteric spirituality, whether that be the Bayon, whether that be Orthodox Christianity, whether that be indigenous spiritualities or whatever, is the model. This is what people need to be looking at, right? And all these other things on the sides. And that the thing about Orthodox Christianity that I find extremely interesting is that it already has a very strong environmentalist narrative. You know, they have prayers for plants and forests and you know, animals, etc. At least, you know, from what some of my Eastern Orthodox friends say. So, you know, the model exists, but the economic and the political theory now needs to come apart. So we need to throw out the postmodernism and the deconstruction and this stuff that has been corrosive. Some of the stuff with the Frankfurt School that work, we need to keep and then augment and expand and make these ideas evolve. But the environmental Marx needs to be at smack in the middle of this. This German from the 19th century and a contemporary of the Bob, you know, who incidentally, the very year that the Communist Manifesto was written was the very year that the Bayan was revealed to the Bob in Malku. And these are one of the coincidences of history that I've been thinking about for a long time. This figure still has a lot of tricks up his sleeve, right?
Yeah.
The biases of yesteryear need to be thrown out. We don't need to deal with the radical atheism anymore because radical atheism is a load of baloney. We don't need to deal with Stalinism anymore. Stalinism is a model that was, you know, patently pathological, and it was a form of, you know, it was a form of national socialism. In fact, Adolf Hitler and the Nazis got a lot of inspiration from Stalin. You know, believe it or not, this is the irony of the history of the Third Reich. All of the old ways of doing things, these models that have been discredited need to be thrown out. There are also, however, contemporaneous to that, models that have worked. So, as I've said many times to many people, although we don't need to replicate it exactly how they do it, the Zapatistas of Mexico offer an extremely potent and valuable model of a socialist society that actually works.
Yeah.
Why? Because it acknowledges indigeneity, number one. Number two, it is completely ecologically focused, right? And number three, it has the ability to intellectually hybridize between many different worldviews simultaneously.
Yes.
So its socialism is not its Marxism is not a very narrow-minded, straight-jacketed form of Marxism of the past. It's one that has the ability to adapt.
Yeah.
So this is what we're looking at. This is where we need to go. And this is why I encourage people who are very interested in these ideas, to look at Mr. Kohei Sato's book, Karl Marx's Eco-Socialism, because what Sato offers in that book is a perspective, a theoretical perspective on Karl Marx that has thus far, heretofore, not been appreciated. So everything that people thought Marxism was, it wasn't. And this begins with Marx himself. And just as, for example, you know, it is actually, in my opinion, absolutely essential that the Bob, in the consciousness of Iranians, come back, you know, as he was. Now is the time that we get to see Karl Marx in his full spectrum. Both the Karl Marx of dialectical materialism as well as the Karl Marx of his ecological theory of metabolism simultaneously. And with that, I think we should leave it there because we're right at the cusp of 1 hour.
All right, sounds good.
And this has been a pretty good conversation. So until next time, God bless everybody.
Later.